be here this evening to talk with David. David, thanks for coming.
It's a pleasure. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm
The
sorry,
witch-
I'm excited. I haven't stayed up this late for many years. It's like New Year's Eve.
Yes, it's the witching hour, David. It's going to be a whole different style of
Yeah,
conversation.
a little weary. Yeah.
A little weary. I'd love to start our conversation by one of the things that you had said to me not long ago was that you think of Sweet Sorrow as and the two previous novels as kind of forming coming together as to form an informal trilogy.
Yeah.
And I'd love to sort of ask you what does that mean to you, an informal trilogy, and how did that feed into kind of this project when you launched it?
Well, it wasn't really conscious, I suppose, and I'd hate for it to seem kind of portentous, but the first of them, One Day, which is about Emma and Dexter, that covers their relationship between the ages of 22 to 42, and I wanted to write about that kind of middle section of that difficult journey into proper adulthood, when perhaps you don't necessarily feel ready. So that was Emma and Dexter's story. And when I came to write another book, I thought, well, I need to write a different kind of love story. I need to write about all of the things that were left out of One Day. So that's marriage and parenthood and what happens when the kids leave home. So that was a novel about characters in their 50s. Douglas, the narrator, and Connie are aged between about 32 and 55, I think. And then of course, you sit down to write the next one and you think, well, I can't do that again. I need to do something different. I wanted to write a love story. I'd never really written about first love. I'd never really written about the beginning of it all. And first love, by its very nature, is a unique experience. You know, it only happens once and then it's gone. And it seemed to have a particular quality that was a big contrast to Us, which was a rather melancholy, occasionally quite bitter, sad book. So I wanted to go all the way back to the beginning. So if you put the three of them together, they're all about falling in love from the age of 16 to the age of 55, and the highs and lows of that, and the difficulties of growing up at all those stages of your life, different difficulties of family life, of parenthood. So there are sort of, without me consciously setting out to do this, there's sort of romantic epic, I suppose, of those eras.
You make a decision, which I love, which is that the narrator is not a 16 or 17 when he's telling the story of this first love. Can you talk a little bit about why you made that decision? How did you pick how old he would be, and how did that sort of change the narrative for you?
I mean, the very first novel I wrote, Start of a 10, was written in the voice of an 18-year-old. And that's terrific fun, you know, because you can point up the sort of the foolishness of that, and the kind of earnestness and the pretentiousness, and have fun with getting that voice absolutely spot on. And again, I didn't want to repeat myself. So I thought I wanted to write a memory book. You know, I wanted to write about the kind of what Charlie calls the fond embarrassment you have when you look back. So it's someone looking back at their youth from a particular viewpoint, and that's a lovely structure for a novelist. You know, it's a structure you find in Jane Eyre or Great Expectations. That the outlook of the narrator comes from a mysterious place, a place that will be revealed as you work your way through the story. So where Charlie is now as a narrator depends on what happens in the story he tells. I like that structure very much, and I just didn't want to recreate a 16-year-old's voice. I can feel that can sometimes be a bit limiting. Instead, I wanted it to be a book about memory, about nostalgia, about regret, about the experience of looking back with a certain amount of wisdom. It's quite a neutral narrator's voice. You know, it's not something. The narrator of Us, the last novel, has a very distinctive, quite overbearing voice. This is more neutral. But I wanted to write, a book about memory, how nostalgia has a kind of tug on us and also a hold. Charlie is a lot younger than I am. You know, it's not my 16th year. I was 16 in 1983. This is a novel set largely in 1997. And I thought it was important also not to write my own diary, not to write my own experiences, but to imagine myself into someone from a different era, and also to write from the point of view of a 38-year-old who's at a very particular point in his life. I felt that if Charlie was my age and he was still fixating on the events of this particular summer, that it would have a different quality, that perhaps there'd be a kind of, you'd sort of want to shake him and tell him to snap out of it. Whereas, as you discover in the course of the novel, Charlie is at a very particular point. Something has just happened. There's a reason for him telling this story that is hopefully sympathetic.
I mean, I imagine that, or it's certainly true in the course of reading the book, that by choosing someone of that age, you have the benefit of being able to comment and analyze the experience of the younger self in a way that you can't quite do it if you're in that first person 16-year-old.
Yeah, the comedy becomes observational rather than the irony of the character not quite realizing what's going on. You know, that's the great joy of writing in a young person's voice. The older reader can see all the stuff that's happening, and the narrator that perhaps can't. But this is someone looking back and kind of, not in a mortified way, but just feeling a little bit sad about certain things that happened, regretful, rueful. The kind of key line in the novel is the greatest lie that old people tell about youth is that it's somehow free of care. Doesn't anyone remember? And I suppose that was the theme. I wanted to write very frankly and honestly about the experience of youth and young love and that gap that opens up between you and your parents, but with a certain amount of wisdom and regret.
You were just talking about your interest in doing a memory-based project, and you open this novel with a passage from the American writer William Maxwell.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to read briefly from this epigraph to sort of set up the questions and for the benefit of those who are listening. But it's from So Long, See You Tomorrow. And it opens by saying, what we, or at any rate, what I refer to confidently as memory, is really a form of storytelling that goes on continually in the mind and often changes with the telling. And then goes on to concludes this passage by observing, in any case, in talking about the past, we lie with every breath we draw. And so as someone who wanted to look at, do on a memory book, can you talk about the Maxwell passage and sort of the notion of how you were going to take this idea of memory as being a tale-telling form of invention, even under the best of circumstances, a type of lying at all times.
Yeah, I mean, Maxwell is a wonderful writer, an underrated writer, and that book is a favorite of mine. And that passage, when I read it, it sort of blew me away, really. The notion that when we look back, we tend to give our lives a structure that it doesn't necessarily possess in the moment, you know, that we kind of, even the notion of first love is often a construct, you know, that Charlie, when he meets Fran, sets out to fall in love. You know, he wants it to happen. That doesn't necessarily make it less sincere or less important, but there's an element of myth-making in his experience that perhaps becomes clearer further on with the benefit of some distance. Similarly, he has a particular view of his relationship with his father in the moment that isn't the view that he has later in life. The view that he has later in life is perhaps more forgiving, wiser. He sees things in a different way, notices things that in the moment he dismissed. So I like the idea of writing a character at different stages of their life. And the other one, almost, the older version, almost watching it and seeing how things might have been different, the things that he got wrong, the mistakes he made, the things he shouldn't have said, and perhaps trying to sort of make amends in the present day.
Yep. One of the things that you mentioned to me is it's kind of interesting. When I asked you the first time about kind of the course that you went through to come to this project, writing this novel, there was a group of different things that you kind of each the sentence always opened the same way, which was, I'd always wanted to do, and then fill in the blank. And there were like 6 things. Yeah. So I want to unpack that sort of and talk about 2 of them, you know, but separately. And the first one, or maybe actually 3 of them, but one of them was that you wanted to do something about Shakespeare, or drawing on Shakespeare, or tied to Shakespeare. And so I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit. What was the driving impulse, and how did that shape kind of what were the different? Did you think of a variety of different ways in which to do that before you landed on on what is, and for those of you who have not read the book yet, I'm not giving anything away. A young man does end up joining a troupe who are going to put on a Shakespearean play. But yeah, so how did talk about your interest in putting Shakespeare in a novel?
Yeah, I mean, I went to a similar school to Charlie, which is quite a tough school, and yet I always kind of loved Shakespeare from the very first exposure. And when I was 13 or 14, a TV production of Macbeth, I never went to the theatre. All the Shakespeare I saw was on television, and I found the language so vivid and exciting, and I didn't understand all of it, but I really loved him on screen, and I saw all of those film adaptations, Polanski's Macbeth and the Zeffirelli Romeo and Juliet and everything, and I loved it. And when I became a professional actor, those were the parts I always really, really wanted. I was in endless productions of Midsummer Night's Dream, Park, Lysander, Demetrius. I played everyone, and I've always loved the plays. And the romantic comedies, Much Ado About Nothing in particular, has always been a big influence for me. I mean, Much Ado About Nothing is the original great romantic comedy. Pride and Prejudice comes from it. When Harry Met Sally comes from it. They all draw from that great romantic tradition. And what I particularly love about the Shakespeare romantic tradition is that it's shot through with this melancholy, with this sadness. Even in the brightest and lightest of plays, there's usually a point in the fourth act or at the beginning of the fifth act where something terrible happens, where a character dies or a moment of mourning is introduced. There's always this sense that things could pitch over into catastrophe. And I love that about the comedies. I love that they're completely uplifting without ever really being sentimental. There were elements in Shakespeare's comedies that I wanted to put in the novel. The idea that when you leave the town and go into the woods, something different happens. That's an idea you find in As You Like It and Two Gentlemen of Verona and A Midsummer Night's Dream. The idea that the idea of a kind of lyricism, the idea of, I've never written a novel set in the countryside. All of my novels until now have been urban. And I love the idea that Charlie leaves the limits, the literal town limits, and goes into this place and meets a group of people and his life changes. I loved the idea not just of copying a Shakespeare tradition, but also kind of critiquing it. I mean, when I planned this novel, it was going to be a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, just because it's a play I knew so well. And then I thought, well, if you're writing about first love, it's perverse not to write for it not to be a production, the great play about first love. But I didn't want it to be one of those Shakespeare stories where the contemporary story magically mimics the storyline of Romeo and Juliet. So the events between Charlie and Fran complement Romeo and Juliet. In Romeo and Juliet fall in love at first sight. They don't share a word. They just see each other and something happens. It's Cupid's bow. It's that tradition. Whereas we all know that in real life, 16-year-olds meeting and talking is a hugely awkward, stumbling, difficult business of exchanging views and tentatively feeling your way. In Shakespeare's play, Romeo and Juliet meet, and they immediately start speaking in sonnet form. The first exchange they have is a sonnet. And in real life, it's, what school do you go to? All that kind of awkward, tentative stuff. So I also wanted not just to draw on a Shakespearean tradition, but to kind of critique it and play with it and take elements of, in Romeo and Juliet, there's a moment of miscommunication, a message doesn't get through, and that changes the course of the character's fate. And I wanted to put a moment like that in the novel as well, as a kind of, almost a tribute to that amazing play.
Gotcha. So having said that, I wanted to touch on a couple of these items that you were like, I want to do a book about that. One of them was, which is overlapping with this last conversation, is the theater. So you mentioned, it was mentioned briefly earlier that you had a personal interest in the theater and were an actor and as a young person or threw yourself into these things, but you wanted to visit that environment to investigate it, right, or to celebrate it in some way. Yeah. So what's the history of that, and what were the contours of the theatrical production that you wanted to capture in the novel?
I never went to the theatre as a kid or as a teenager. You know, there was no theatre near us. And I loved film and I loved television drama, but I wasn't a great theatre goer. But what I always loved was being in plays. And I went to quite a tough school where none of the boys would be in the plays. So I got any role I wanted pretty much. And I got lulled into this full sense of success as an actor. And I really loved the experience of putting on a show, the kind of drama of it, and the camaraderie and all the rivalries and politics of it. And that sort of carried me into university. I mean, I did a degree in drama and English, again, without ever really going to the theatre, just because I loved the business of being in a company. And most of my 20s was spent at the National Theatre, where I understudied and played small parts. And again, I don't think I ever thought that I was going to be a really successful actor. For me, it was enough to be part of an ensemble. And that's what I loved and what I wanted to try and put in the book. But it's very hard to write about the world of theatre in a passionate, enthusiastic way. Charlie thinks it's a preposterous world. He thinks that they're all pretentious and ridiculous and self-involved. And I wanted to write about it from an outsider's point of view, to take on board the fact that it can sometimes seem like quite an exclusive world, something that is there for the benefit of the participants rather than the audience, and to have Charlie's skepticism and cynicism about theatre, about Shakespeare, about this group of people gradually worn down over the course of the novel. So he does fall in love with it without ever really feeling part of it. I never really felt part of the theatre world either. You know, it always seemed not quite right for me. I realized latterly that I really stuck with it mainly because I loved writing. I loved the whole business of characters and stories and jokes and situations. And being an actor was really the only way for me to keep hold of that. And I think that's why I stuck with it for so long through most of my 20s. And I learned a lot about writing from failing as an actor.
Okay. The third sort of driver that you mentioned when we were having the conversation, having said, you know, that you wanted to do something that involved Shakespeare, you wanted to revisit a theatrical troupe and sort of the camaraderie and chemistry of that. The third one was that you were very eager, interested in doing a summer play, or summer story. And when you mentioned that, you said, well, you know, like so-and-so, 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 like you know, and rattle off immediately, you know, a series of summer books. I'd love to hear you sort of talk about what is a summer book? What is a summer story? And you know, what are the rules of the game, as it were? What are the benefits and difficulties? You know, why was that something you wanted to do?
I mean, it's something that I'm aware of without ever wanting it to become, I mean, if I describe it, I'm worried that it'll sound like a cliche, but I suppose I was thinking of a number of stories. American stories, Goodbye Columbus, you know, for the great early Philip Roth, which is a love affair that takes place over the course of the summer. I also thought of not necessarily love stories, but The Go-Between, a wonderful novel, which again is a love affair that takes a doomed love affair observed by a child over the course of the summer. I love the fact that they have a kind of inbuilt ending. This novel, Sweet Sorrow, has 3 acts, June, July, August. And by the time you get to August, there's a sense of the leaves turning and summer coming to an end and time running out. In September, everyone's going to go off to their college and Charlie's going to be left behind. So there's a kind of an inbuilt sadness in summer. There's also a wonderful song by the British band Pulp called David's Last Summer, which is about that sense you get, you know, there's a wonderful line in it about walking home from a party and feeling the leaves turning and the swallows leaving, a sense of sadness that's built into even the brightest summer day. And I wanted to get that sense into this novel, a sense that this can only last so long and it's going to fade. I'm not a summer person. I can't bear it really, because there's this obligation to be, you know, for it to be picnics and jumping in rivers, and I much prefer the sadness of the honest sadness of autumn and winter. But summer to me does have a sense. You're aware, intently aware, that this thing is coming to an end. And that seemed appropriate for a love story, especially a love story about first love, because first love tends not to last forever. It's very, very rare for you to spend the rest of your life with your first love. and yet it's a life-changing relationship. It's one that stays with you. Even if you look back at it with a certain amount of embarrassment, it's a good first love is a terrific thing to have.
Did you find, I've written a book where it's 1 year exactly, in essence. You know,
Yeah.
it begins on January 1st and ends on New Year's Eve for the most part. One of the interesting things for me about that was that it creates a sort of a structure that you're operating.
Yeah.
And as your imagination is kind of filling in the early months, you know you're running out of time. I mean, your characters are running out of time because this concluding moment's going to come, and that starts to shape kind of how you think of events and how your imagination. Did you find that and kind of
absolutely
laying out that story?
Even though it's a summer novel, the working title for it was initially Summer, and then for a long time when I was writing it was called September, because Charlie has sort of failed at school. He doesn't really know what's going to happen in the autumn, and September is the kind of the deadline. It's the end of the carefree months. It's the time at which real life is going to kick in, and I love the idea, yes, as you say, that there's a kind of almost a ticking clock there all the way through, that this can't last, even though the experience, I did want it to be, joyous. When we're talking about a summer novel, I suppose that's another quality of it, a kind of sense of elation, a sense of passion about not just the love affair, but friendships he makes and the music that he discovers and the words that he finds in Shakespeare, the way of expressing himself that he finds through being in this play. But all the time, this sense that when September comes around, life is going to kick in and he's going to have to make some difficult decisions. So yeah, I love that tension and that inbuilt, I'm trying not to use the word melancholy too much, but it's a melancholic sense, I think.
I think we've all shared it.
Yeah.
In our own lives. I was going to ask you about it. Oh, the first I want to touch on, you mentioned a song, and you put it in your acknowledgments, right?
Yeah.
The song that you wanted to tribute as one of the influences in writing the book.
Yeah.
Music plays a big part in the book. It's a part of the landscape, and of course it would be in a bunch of young, 16-year-olds who are hanging out and falling in love and drinking, whatever. There's always kind of music on the periphery.
Yeah.
You talk about the music in the book, but also in your process. Do you have music playing when you write? How does music work in David's office?
It's interesting. When I was writing this book and writing about, I know exactly what I was listening to when I was 16, but I as I said, I'm a little older, these characters. So when I was starting to write the book, my first anxious question to my slightly younger friends was, what were you listening to? Because there's a danger when you're writing a novel that's set in a particular year to just kind of slather it in songs of that day and age. And of course, we all know from our own experience that we tend to listen to older music. So the music that's most heavily featured in the book are sort of Nina Simone songs that Fran introduces to Charlie, and These Days by Velvet Underground. Songs that have a kind of, that you discover at that age, which seem to have a sophistication and sadness in them. So there is a soundtrack to the book. I mean, it's on Spotify, but it's not just music from '97. When I'm writing, certainly when I was writing one day, if I wanted to capture a particular year, I did find myself digging up certain songs. There are a lot of nightclub scenes in One Day, Dexter going to these kind of wild parties and behaving badly. And I did write one or two of those to that music. But now I think something's happened to my brain and I can't do it anymore. I can't have any kind of vocal playing while I write. I do sometimes. The hardest part of any writing day is the silence at the beginning. And I do sometimes play some Bach, the cello suites or the well-tempered clavier, just so that I can kind of ease into it. But my dream is that the music stops and I don't notice and I just keep typing, because my brain no longer has the capacity to cope with all this stimulation while I put the words on the page. But music, when I was writing One Day, I did want it to feel like a pop song. And with this novel, I did want it to feel like, like a song like These Days, a kind of rueful, major minor song. So I think, music is a big influence, though I rarely listen to it during the writing process now.
Yep. We haven't talked about Charlie's family very yet, and I'd like
Yeah,
to, because on the one hand, obviously the spotlight, as it were, is on Charlie and this new romance that is coming alive. But and you have sort of around that the circle of the acting troupe. Um, but the book is very much a book about family too.
yeah,
But it's kind of and right, and I'm not giving anything away.
yeah.
It's from a family that's in disarray. You learn very quickly. And so can you talk a little bit about that? What is, when you were kind of imagining that you were going to tell a story of adolescent love, how did you, and maybe it's because of your comment of sort of the bittersweetness of the Shakespearean comedies, but how did you end up finding yourself, writing about someone who was in a family where the situation was difficult at that moment, as opposed to sort of a happy character in a happy surrounding.
I mean, on a sort of practical, technical level, I wanted to drive Charlie out of the house. He needed to get into the countryside to escape
I'll
something.
do it.
But as I found myself writing the novel, I found myself writing more and more about the father. The parents break up quite near the beginning of the novel, and the father is suffering from something that no one dares call depression. They say he's a bit blue, he's a little down, he needs a break, all of these euphemisms for depression. So for the largest part of the book, no one even uses the word, but his father is quite clearly clinically depressed and drinking too much. And I wanted to write about being a carer, a carer who doesn't always care, who has all this stuff going on, who wants life to be exciting and exhilarating, the kind of life a 16-year-old expects, but is having to deal with the day-to-day very difficult business of dealing with someone whose situation seems unshakable, and who over the course of the book finds a way of communicating with his father, finds a way of making some kind of progress. My father died about 5 or 6 years ago. I think I can say this. And it wasn't until after he died that I found out that he'd been taking Prozac. And there was never any sense while he was alive that this would have been spoken about. It would have been completely, he would have been embarrassed by it and wouldn't have wanted me to worry and all of these things. And I thought there was the father in the novel is nothing like my own father, but I did think there was something terribly painful and sad about someone who isn't quite prepared to name what they're suffering from. And to try and write about that indirectly, but with some kind of compassion, but also unsentimentally. There's not a moment, this again, I'm not giving too much away, there's not a moment where suddenly this all comes out and there's a kind of I love you, Dad moment. But there is a moment where they, and I would think, that was ever possible. Because he was, going back to that quote from William Maxwell, when I look back, I realized the truth of the situation isn't quite the story I told all those years.
Yeah. And I may get this wrong. The way I remember what you saying to me. So I'm going to quote you to yourself. I think this is what you said.
Okay.
But it was something to the effect of, I make a concerted effort to write away from the truth.
Yeah.
Does that sound right? Does that sound like you?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But so, yeah. And that's sort of, maybe that's in harmony with the comments you were making about your father and how it differs from the father and son in the story. But what does that mean for you? So to make the concerted effort when you're writing a novel to write away from the truth. What do you mean?
I suppose that I would never, on a very practical level, I have a brother and sister. I've never really written about siblings who are remotely like my brother and sister. I would never have a conversation with my parents or anyone in my family and then go away and jot it down and put it in a book. In the novel, Charlie's families explodes. They all separate. It all goes horribly wrong. My parents stayed together, were pretty happily married. It's not to say there weren't things going on, but it's a very different set of circumstances. When I started writing fiction, I thought, well, this is a dilemma. If you write a sister, how do you make sure that it's not your sister? And so I went to great efforts to, to kind of draw on experience, but make sure that I wasn't recreating my own particular specific experiences or circumstances. But something, nevertheless, something always comes through. I've told this story before, I'll tell it very briefly, but when I wrote my first novel, I thought, well, how am I going to deal with the father-son relationship in this novel? I know I will, his father has died before the action in the novel starts. So in the start of it 10, the dad is dead before the actual story begins. And I wrote the novel and completed it and very sheepishly sent it off to my parents saying, here's the first copy, I hope you like it. And my dad didn't mention it for a long, long time. And I began to worry about it because there was a lot of stuff in there about fathers and sons, even though it wasn't him. And finally I said, I hope you like the novel. And he said, yeah, I did like it, but you didn't have to kill me.
Right.
And I suppose I realized that this principle I have of writing away from the truth, not recreating my own biographical circumstances on the page, only goes so far, that it's impossible to conceal your own preoccupations and concerns and anxieties. And why would you want to anyway? So none of it is literally true, but all of it contains some kind of truth.
Sure. You find, I'm tend to be from your camp, as it were. I don't historically write about my childhood in the suburbs of Boston in the 70s. It's not the area that I'm drawn to writing about. But now you look at Edward St. Albans, terrific Melrose books that you wrote the screenplays for. That's kind of the opposite, right? There's no sense. So he's digging very deeply into his own experiences, not word for word, but it's clearly a part of the project for him, and gains a lot of energy from that. I find I'm a closer observer if I'm writing about something that didn't happen to me.
Right. Yeah.
Do you share that sort of?
No, I think I'm somewhere in the middle. I mean, unlike you, I'd be very nervous about writing historical fiction. At a time, I broadly speaking lived through all of these times.
Yes.
I broadly speaking done most of the things these characters do. I was an actor, and that comes into a lot of the books. And certain, Charlie's school is pretty close to the school I went to. But at the same time, I in Charlie's outlook on life or his specific experiences, I don't draw on my own. Charlie hates this business of putting on a play, and I loved it. I'm much more like, often there's another character in the novel who's much more like me. There's a character called George in this novel, who probably is a little closer to me. But I'm somewhere in between, I think. I'm not recreating worlds that I have no experience of. I'm not a great researcher. With my last novel, Us, I wanted to write a scientist, specifically because I'd written so many people who were involved in the arts. And as a younger person, I loved science, and I wanted to try and rediscover that passion for science. And so I did quite a lot of research and into biochemistry, very superficially, but there was some science there.
Yes.
But that's about the extent I'm prepared to go away from things I've lived through. So, and I don't know, perhaps I need to be, whatever comes next. I feel like maybe I've mined pretty deeply into my own particular set of experiences, and I need to do a little more, maybe with time or with a profession or something, just go slightly outside my world.
Maybe you need to go deeper in, like Knausgaard, right?
Yeah, or go deep in. I don't think I could do that either.
Relationship. Can we shift a little bit and talk about your process? We cover a lot of the different angles that you've come to this material from, but can we talk about the process for you when you decide, okay, you're going to write this book? How do you start? Are you an outliner or not? Are you a note taker or not? Do you write by hand or not? And move me chronologically through from idea towards final manuscript.
I mean, the first thing to say is it's different with every book. The first book I wrote, I had in my head for a long time, and I wrote it in 3 months, and it was all my best jokes, all my best, anecdotes, all my best observations, just kind of came pouring out very fluidly. I wrote it because I started in television. I'd always written quite careful scene plans, chapter plans, And I wrote it very quickly according to the plan that I'd spent some time composing, feeling fairly confident that it would work. And it's been different every time since. With this book, my starting point was really a series of themes. First love, putting on a play, the way that language can affect us, the way Charlie is influenced by the play, a family breaking up, the 90s, and summer, and memory. And it was called Summer. And the first attempts at it were just a kind of ragbag scrapbook, little notes on characters, little scenes, little bits of description, little bits of dialogue, playing around. This is very, very important, I think, playing around with first person versus third person, past tense versus present tense, just trying to find a voice. And then there was a more formal document, which was a kind of story breakdown and more detailed biographical notes. And then I took a little bit of time off to work on Melrose and went back to it, because I find that if you can approach your writing as a reader rather than as someone who's freshly written it, then you can be a little bit more critical and find the interesting stuff. So I went back after a while, read it all through, underlined the things that I thought were good, planned the novel, and then started writing. But there's a pretty precise plan, but I feel very strongly that planning is as much to do with character and tone and theme as it is to do with plot. You know, people often talk about you working out the plot. Well, that to me is important, but I need also to know exactly who these characters are. And maybe that goes back to the acting tradition. You know, I need to know their biography and their favorite song and their outlook on life and their physicality and the tone of their voice and how they look and how they carry themselves and how they relate to every other character. It's not just about building individuals, it's about putting them together. And I think a lot of that does come from working in the theatre. You know, that's a very classic actor's approach, knowing not just the biography, but the intention. So that to me is as important to get straight. If I don't really know what the character's dilemma and aim is in a novel, then I'm more likely to get lost than if I haven't worked out the plot. So that's equally important to me. Yeah. And then I do a pretty close first draft, and then you know, maybe a 30% rewrite, and then it doesn't get shown to anyone until I'm pretty sure that it works mechanically and that it just needs attention chapter by chapter, then page by page, then paragraph by paragraph.
Yeah. Can you talk about because someone who, am I right? Do I remember that right, that you were writing for the screen before your first novel?
Yeah. I was a sort of TV series writer. I wrote on a show called Cold Feet, which was a very successful show in the UK. But I was a gun for hire. You know, I was writing other people's characters and stories.
Yeah, and you've continued doing screenwriting as we mentioned. Can you talk about the differences for you of what do you think of as, you know, in essence, I guess, why did you veer off of screenwriting a novel? What did you want to get artistically from the novel that you were not getting from your work
screenwriting? Well, part of it was born out of necessity in that I had a couple of big flops, so I had to find something else to do, you know. And I'd loved fiction. I'd always loved fiction as much as I'd loved film and TV. But I felt rather intimidated at the idea of submitting it. You know, I didn't know anyone in that world. I didn't know any novelists. It seemed almost impertinent to submit prose to someone. You know, there's something very practical about a screenplay. It's an instruction manual. But to say to someone, would you mind reading my novel? I don't know. I just didn't feel that I understood. I felt that there was some secret knowledge that I didn't have. So it took me a long time to find the courage to sit down and do it. And when I did, my first editor said, you know, it's okay to tell the reader what the characters are thinking, because a screenplay is all about action and dialogue. It's about what people say and what they do. And you write this instruction manual and give it to a group of people, and they hopefully make TV and film out of it. But the actual luxury of being able to stop and enter a character's consciousness and explore either what they feel or what they show, or the difference between what they do and what they think and feel. That is fascinating, and that's the great gift that you have as a novelist. You also have a very straightforward gift of just being able to tell the reader, you know, you can just convey information in a very, very straightforward way. You can just tell the reader that this is his sister, not his lover. It's very, very straightforward. And that's great, because in a screenplay, you have to contrive all these ways to convey this information in a discreet way. There's no budget with a novel. There's no running time. There are the looser parameters of genre, I think, perhaps. You don't have to, you don't have to justify every single line in a novel. In a screenplay, someone will always try not to film it. They'll always say, do we need this scene? What is it doing? What is it doing that the other scenes aren't doing? And novels can be not too loose, but it's okay to go off on tangents. There's a certain pleasure in that. And so that's a great luxury, to be able to not indulge yourself, but have a certain influence, and for everything on the page not to fulfill a very particular function is also a great luxury. And I have to stop, because I could talk about this for a long time. I love both. The great gift that you have as a novelist is the very intense, straightforward relationship with the reader. As a screenwriter, you trade in a lot of power, but instead you get acting and lighting and design and editing and music and all of those wonderful things as well. So I hope always to do both, even though screenwriting for me is much, much, much more alarming, much more stressful, much more confrontational. I still kind of love it.
Yep. I think it would be great. This is a good time to, I think, see if anybody has any questions. Everybody, thank you for joining us, everybody, and for joining David, for joining McNally Jackson, me. Yes, can we go ahead and if anybody has a question, I guess you'd have to submit it through the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Unless McNally Jackson can turn on your mic, but I'm not sure if they can. I don't know.
Yes, I haven't looked at those. Should I? I wonder if I should. Do I dare look?
I don't know. No.
No. Okay. You can tell me. You can. I'll let you choose.
Yeah. We'll see. We'll see if we don't have a question yet, which is fine. But
okay.
We'll see. We've covered a lot, so maybe there aren't questions. But okay, here we go from Janice McLeod. Your books are so funny that I can't help but imagine you giggling to yourself as you write. Is this in fact the case? Do you write just to amuse yourself first?
There's a certain satisfaction in knowing that a joke is good, or it's a line of dialogue is good, even if that doesn't last. Often you look back at it and you think, no, that isn't going to make the cut. But I certainly don't laugh to myself. It's a much more painful experience than that. But I do, I mean, with a screenplay, there's a great pleasure in hearing it spoken aloud and feeling that it works. But no, I find, if anything, for me, the most demanding, when I started writing, I was writing mainly comedy, and I felt an obligation to constantly be funny. And I think I was probably like one of those people at a dinner party who can't stop making jokes. And I found it hard as a writer to calm down a little bit and write more in a more straight-faced way, write description, write something that was perhaps more sincere. And so comedy to me is my natural instinct. And being more serious, more somber, I have to, I'm less secure about. I do it a lot now, but I feel a little bit jumpy about it. But I don't laugh to myself, but I do feel a certain satisfaction at a good joke on the page. I can't tell a joke in real life at all. I mean, my family would be horrified if I start telling a conventional joke with a punchline. I'm not particularly, witty, but I like the specific rhythm of a joke on the page and the precision of the language that makes something funny.
Thank you. This is a question from Rachel. We discussed earlier the loose trilogy, the informal trilogy, and her question and about the difference of stages of love that you've written in the course of your 3 novels. Any plans to write about love or relationships in old age?
Well, maybe. I mean, that's fascinating, isn't it? It's a fascinating subject. I've always written, when I wrote Us, I thought, I'm going to really push myself now. I'm going to write about someone in their 50s, in their mid-50s. And now here I am in my mid-50s. And it's not, certain things don't feel particularly different. So there's no reason, I suppose, to be scared of writing about someone, 15, 20 years older than myself. And there have been some wonderful books about love and old age. So it might be something worth exploring. Yeah, I like to feel that you know, it's interesting to me. When I began writing this book, I thought 16 is a long time ago. Do you remember what that's like? Do you really remember what that's like? And that came pretty easily. You know, I found that time to be very formative and very vivid in my mind. It's perhaps a little harder to speculate on what something in the future will feel like. But again, you have to be, you know, you have to take a leap.
Uh, this is from Amanda, David. Do
Hi.
you get any input on the castings of the film or slash TV versions of your characters?
More so now, and more so in television. You know, because in television it's quite common for the writer to be a producer. You're a little bit further up the pecking order in television, whereas in film the director is king, and there are all kinds of commercial concerns with, you know, particularly around casting. So you perhaps have less say in that. But in television, I do get a say. But at the same time, I'm respectful of the fact that I'm not the person who turns up on set every day and works with a particular actor. So I try not to exercise. I don't have a veto, and even if I did, I would try not to exercise it too much, because it's not my skill, it's not my job, and I'm very happy to delegate that kind of thing. At the same time, I like to be involved if I can. Yeah. So the short answer is I have some say, particularly in television, but not the casting vote.
Do you have a film project pending from I think you mentioned that you might be interested in doing the work on Sweet Sorrow.
Well, I'm currently working on a screenplay of Sweet Sorrow. Yeah, and again, you know, we were talking earlier about the difference. It's very painful because a lot of the pleasure, I hope, in the book is the inside of Charlie's mind, the fact that he isn't quite coming across how he wants to, a kind of inner monologue, and the observation of the older Charlie. Excuse me. When you turn that into a screenplay, you lose all of that. You know, you lose. There's no room in the screenplay for observation, really. It's all about what they say and do. So that's proven quite demanding, but I'm also really enjoying it because it'll be hopefully a great coming of age story. I wrote a little while ago an adaptation of a favorite book of mine, Danny the Champion of the World by Roald Dahl, which is a wonderful book, I think, by far away my favorite Roald Dahl novel. And that is in development, as they say. And the next thing I'm going to do, I think, will be a screenplay. But as I say, I find it very stressful. And there's a kind of pleasure in the solitude of writing a novel, a pleasure in the kind of control you have to the work. The best thing about it is there's no collaboration. You know, it's your work, you get the final say. And that's also the hardest thing about it as well. It can be, I'm sure, as you know, quite lonely. And yet when it's going well, I really love it, and would do nothing but if it was always like that.
Right. We have a question here from Landy, and this is the last question that we have here. If anybody has one last question you want to submit it, please do so now.
Yeah.
But from Landy, David, writing from Mexico City. Wishing you well. Landy wishes you well.
Yes.
The question is, do you plan the stories in detail before you write them, or do you let them emerge on the fly?
The only time I ever tried to make it up as I went along, I got terribly stuck and I ended up abandoning quite a large chunk of a novel. I mean, 30,000 words. And I found out that actually, again, that screenwriting instinct is probably good. You know, I tend to think, not consciously, but I tend to have an awareness of acts and of certain story beats and of needing certain set pieces at particular times and certain turning points. And that's something that I carry with me. And even if I don't write a detailed scene plan, which I used to do, I have it in my head. So yeah, I'm not an improviser. No, I have a pretty good sense of what's coming.
Gotcha. Somebody did pop in here. Hold on a second, David. Yes. This is from Af.
Yes.
Your stories of love are often set in the past with social engagement. Would you find it more difficult to try and write love stories for the modern day with more people meeting on the internet, phones, and a contemporary environment?
That's a good question. You know, I didn't, when I was doing the press for Sweet Sorrow, someone said to me, they said, what are you going to do next? And I said, well, I think I really need to write about love now. You know, I need to write about I want to write a really smart contemporary romantic comedy about that whole business in this day and age. And they said, aren't you a little bit old for that? And I suddenly thought, oh God, maybe I am. You know, maybe there's a whole world out there that I don't really know about. And you know, I haven't been on a date for 23 years. You know, I imagine the experience is very different, and that's quite intimidating. At the same time, that's not a reason not to do it. Maybe that's a reason to do it. Maybe that's something that I should kind of roll my sleeves up and get on with. So I wouldn't be frightened of doing it. And I'm sure the next piece of fiction I write will be set in the present day and age. So maybe that's something I'll have to take on board.
There's no reason that your book about old love can't have the iPhone and the internet as a part of it.
Exactly.
You have to merge the two. Well, David, thank you so much for your time. It was really a pleasure talking to you again.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you very much.
To the audience. Please remember, if you enjoyed this chat, you can buy David's book at McNally Jackson. And please buy all of Amor's books too. And thank you for coming.
Thanks, everybody. And have a great summer.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.